Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Environmental Monitoring, Getting Started. I have just a few housekeeping notes to mention. If you have any sound or technical issues today, please let us know in the chat box with a direct message. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with a PDF version of the slideshow, as well as a list of supplemental resources, will be sent out to all registrants within the next week or so. And finally, we do have some built-in time at the end to answer any questions that may come up, but please feel free to type them into the chat box at any point throughout the presentation, and we will get to them all at the end. Now, before we get started, I just wanted to share a little bit about the Documentary Heritage Preservation Services for New York for anyone who is unfamiliar with us. DHPSNY, as we like to call it, is a collaboration between the New York State Archives Documentary Heritage Program and the New York State Library Conservation and Preservation Program, with services provided by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts. DHPSNY is a statewide program that provides free planning and education services to support the vast network of collecting institutions, such as archives, libraries, historical societies, museums, and other organizations that safeguard and ensure access to New York's historical records and library research materials. DHPSNY services include archival needs assessments, preservation and conservation surveys, guidance with strategic planning, and access to a variety of educational programs, such as this webinar. To learn more about our services, please visit DHPSNY.org. And with that, I pass this along to today's presenter, Chloe Houseman, Paper Conservator at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Leah. I'm so happy to be here with all of you today, talking about environmental monitoring, a topic that's just so interesting and everyone will love, but it's very important, but can be dry at times. So I've tried to keep this presentation interesting. Yes, environmental monitoring getting started is the title, as Leah said. So first things first. What is it? What are we talking about? What is environmental monitoring? It's pretty much what the name tells you it is. It's very self-explanatory. It's monitoring your environment at the basis level. But what does that really mean? It pretty much is keeping track of and monitoring metrics like temperature, relative humidity, and light exposure for your collections and in your collection storage spaces. This is done via equipment like hygrothermographs, which I have in the bottom left here, data loggers, there's an example of a data logger in the bottom center, and manual recording from equipment like thermometers and light meters, and I have an LSEC in the bottom right, which can measure any number of things, but we'll talk a little bit more about LSECs later. So we kind of know what it is. It's like, all right, how hot is it? How cold is it? Is it wet in here? Who knows? But how does this help us from collections standpoint? Good environmental monitoring and environmental control can increase the longevity of your collections. It also is a preventative measure to help keep your collections in good condition. So if you're starting out with something in good condition, this will help keep it that way. If something's in poorer condition, it'll also help prevent it from degrading further. Or at least it will help prevent that from happening as quickly as it would in, a completely sort of Wild West uncontrolled environment. It can also help resolve issues before they become a big problem. So, if you're generally monitoring your environment and you know the trends and you understand what the environment in your space is like on the day-to-day, and then something starts to be different or strange, you can often catch things like, oh, that dehumidifier for our HVAC stopped working. And I noticed because I saw a couple degrees difference that isn't usually there. Whereas if you're not monitoring it, you probably wouldn't notice just from being in the space of a small difference like that. It also helps to protect sensitive collections. And we'll talk again a little bit more about this later. The sensitivity of collections to environment varies based on material type, but collections that include things like photographs and film are particularly vulnerable and have very particular environments in which they thrive. So it can help with those specific types of collections and keeping them healthy, I guess you could say. And like I sort of alluded to with my earlier example, Environmental monitoring familiarizes you with what's normal for your space, what the standard is. So anomalies and problems are more apparent. Like I kind of went over previously, unlike this dog, if it is very hot in your zone, that's not great. It is not fine. And you should know what is regular for you and your facility. Now, this is going to be different for everyone. So, if you are working somewhere that's like along the equator, what is standard temperature and humidity for you is going to be different than someone who's, in in Pennsylvania, where I am right now. So you have to keep that in mind as well. But just know what your normal is. All right, so first things first. Before you go to set up an environmental monitoring program and system, there are a lot of things that you should be thinking about beforehand that will impact your program. So first things first, what kind of control do you have over the environment in the first place? What is your current heating or cooling system, if any? How well and accurately do these systems, if they exist, control your environment? Is humidity included? Many HVAC systems will also have humidistats and humidifiers, dehumidifiers built in. Can you control it in sections, or is there sort of one control for your whole building or area? And also, who is controlling the environment? So is it just the director? Is it a maintenance person who just sets the thermostat to whatever they think is appropriate? Who is the person who's currently deciding what your environment is, and why are they making those decisions? You also have to think about, that's kind of the first step, and then you kind of work out from there. You have to think about your building as a whole. And this will be very different based on the type of place you work. So for a lot of smaller institutions or like historic homes or other historic buildings, this is going to be a much bigger concern than for, a new construction gallery or museum. But yeah, the building envelope, which just means like a literal envelope, is it sealed? So are there doors or windows that are open or cracked or drafty? Are there chimneys that aren't sealed? Things like that. Is there a vestibule for when folks come in to help prevent, rise or drop in temperature around the front door area? And there's, checklists for going through your building envelope and looking through all this stuff. But these are just a few examples to get you started thinking about that sort of thing. And lastly, are there any pre-existing measuring devices that you already have on site? If you already have a heating or cooling system, there's probably some sort of control thermostat there, or humidistat, like I said, if humidity control is included in your system. These are not necessarily the most accurate, and we're going to talk a little bit later about data loggers and other monitoring systems that you can use to have a slightly better handle. But if this is what you have and this is what you're starting with, just having a general idea of, okay, the thermostat is set to 72, so it's probably around within several degrees of 72. That's a great place to start. I also mentioned hygrothermographs because these are not as common nowadays, but may be common if you had an environmental monitoring program that's a bit older, or someone used to do this a while ago. I had to use a hygrothermograph in grad school, and you like feed the paper into it on the cylinder, and it goes around, and the needles go up and down to record your humidity, and it's very fun, but not, again, 100% accurate. But yeah, anything you have can be really helpful. So I think the moral of this slide is take stock of everything that you know and everything that could possibly be useful, because the rest of this is going to be a lot of, you need to get this, you need to do this, you need to figure this out. So anything that can work for you from the start is a positive. All right, so once you've thought of all of these things and your head is spinning and you've made a million notes and you're starting to feel overwhelmed, which is likely to happen, but don't despair, it'll be okay. You can do it. How do you actually set up your environmental monitoring program? First things first, you have to figure out how you're going to get readings. How are you getting the data for this program? Data loggers, which I showed an image of an example data logger in, I think, my first slide, are generally preferable, but taking manual readings are absolutely fine if that's more accessible to you for whatever reason, whether it's monetary concerns or what have you. These are both perfectly fine ways to gather data. So if you're going for data loggers, what type are you going to get? How many? Where will they be located in the building? If you're doing manual readings, some similar questions. How often are you taking readings? Who is responsible for these? And again, where in the building are these readings being taken? Because that should be consistent if you are doing manual readings. It shouldn't be like, I'm taking a reading in this room. It should be like in this corner of this room at this time of day, as much as is feasible for consistency across data. Next up, where are you putting this data? Because getting data at all is a very important first step, but knowing that it's stored somewhere that's accessible by not just you, but other people who work at your institution is very important. It's super easy to make just like a spreadsheet to record all of this in. And even if you're going around and making physical notes in a notebook first, but then putting it onto a spreadsheet or just some digital something. A, because it makes it a lot easier to analyze your data that way, and B, again, so you can make sure that you and your coworkers can continue to access it and it isn't just in your notebook sort of gathering dust and not working for you. Because if you're taking this data down and you're not doing anything with it, then you're not helping yourself the way that you really could be with an environmental monitoring program. And last point here is to create an environmental monitoring log to note unusual occurrences or circumstances that could skew your data. So I have just a couple of rows of my personal environmental monitoring log that I keep for CCAHA from 2020 that shows an example of a couple of events that can skew data. So when I'm looking back at data and I see a weird spike or a weird dip, if I'm looking at it that day, I can say, oh, it's because, in this example, it was really hot that day, like more so than usual, and we weren't expecting it, and I didn't have time to adjust the thermostats, so it got spicier than usual in the paper lab. But when I'm looking at that data, 2, 3, 4 months from now, I'm not gonna, in all likelihood, remember that was the cause. So keeping a log like this with any occurrence that can skew data and make like weird things happen is really helpful when you're looking back at it later, especially if you're doing any kind of like, quarterly reports, so you can account for that. All right, as I think I've alluded to, I am in charge of the environmental monitoring program at CCAHA, and it's, in my opinion, very important to have like a point person who is in charge of your program. It's great if everyone's involved, but I think there needs to really be a designated person, a team leader, if you will, to make sure that environmental monitoring is not being neglected. And that's just to make sure like readings are being taken, data is being interpreted. If something's going wrong or being weird, who to notify or tell to put something in the log, that sort of thing. You also need to figure out what your goal temperature and relative humidity are. So I'm going to talk here in a second about best practice recommendations, what you should be aiming for in an ideal world, but I know and understand that we unfortunately do not live and work in an ideal world. So these are general guidelines to keep in mind, but what's more important than doing everything you can to get this exact temperature is having something that's consistent. So if it's not realistic for you to get these numbers that I'm about to talk to you about, pick a number that is, even if it's not quote unquote in the ideal range. What's somewhat more important is just having a consistent environment year round to whatever extent is possible for you. So in 2010, AIC, the American Institute for Conservation, the Environmental Guidelines Working Group put together some general numbers of like, okay, these are good ranges for most collections to exist in. So this is an umbrella recommendation, and I've got a infographic here at the bottom that is actually from CCAHA's. It's a publication we have on our website called a Collections Environment Infographic that shows more specific ranges for specific types of media. and that'll be linked in the resources that Leah provides later. But the general recommendations from AIC are to aim between 49 and 57 degrees Fahrenheit and 45 and 55% relative humidity. Now, 49 degrees is pretty cold and 57 degrees is still pretty cold. So especially if you are in a building or a space where your environmental control for your collections and non-collections areas are on the same thermostat, this is going to be very difficult to achieve, while also still taking into account human comfort and ability to work. I don't know that I could comfortably work in a building that was always, 53 degrees. I don't think that would be workable for me. And again, if you do have individual control of your vault or storage space and you can achieve this, that's wonderful. But all parts of your facility have to work together. So if you have to have one blanket temperature everywhere, do something that's good enough that gets you close, then that doesn't make your coworkers want to kill you. I know a number of my coworkers have work blankets because it's not that cold here, I promise, but it's chillier than most would maybe prefer. So, look out for that if you do take over the environmental monitoring program for wherever you work. People will always say, "Ooh, can't we just turn it up a little bit? It would be so nice if it were just a little bit warmer in here." All right, where and how to collect data. So I've talked a lot about get all this data and do stuff with it. How do you do that? How does that happen? As I mentioned before, figure out where you're putting your data loggers or where you're taking your readings if you're doing this manually. Think about different variables in the places that you are choosing. Is this area right under a vent, and could that skew the temperature of the room overall that you're getting? Does it get really direct sunlight, so it might heat up more than other areas? And that's not to say that these examples are bad areas to have your data loggers. It's just to know and understand what in the environment is affecting the readings that you're getting. It's also a good idea to consider moving your loggers around, taking readings in different areas for short bursts of time. Again, noted in your environmental monitoring log, which you should have, like we chatted about earlier, to get data on less critical locations. Or if you're just curious, like, the data logger is always in this corner of this room, but does the data change if I move it to this other corner of this room? And if it does change significantly, then that's interesting and something you should investigate why that's happening. Yeah, it is just important to remember that the climate near collections or gallery spaces impacts the climate in those areas. So even if you do have separate temperature and RH control for these areas, if your gallery or collection storage are very cold, but then there's an office right next door to it that's always very hot, it's like putting a hot Tupperware into your freezer. Like, that hot Tupperware is going to affect the frozen food around it, and it's the same type of situation here. So kind of consider how adjacent spaces may be affecting each other positively or negatively. As far as manual data collection, because I've talked a little bit more about data loggers here, really figure out how often you're going to do it. Like I said before, where specifically these readings are being taken, what time of day these readings are being taken, if it's multiple times a day. And this is where I start to talk about how, I know and I understand that manual data collection is sometimes the only option available to folks for whatever reason, but it is by nature much more time intensive. But also keep in mind that any data is better than no data. So even if you're doing it kind of intermittently or like a couple times a week, as opposed to multiple times a day, like that's still great and will give you at least some idea of what your environment is like. All right, so I'm going to talk now about picking data loggers. I'm not going to be recommending specific data logger models or companies. I'm mostly just talking about general things to consider when selecting a data logger. So there are a couple of resources that I've included that do list, sort of comparisons for different specific data loggers in the resources, again, that Leah will provide. But these are, more overall general kind of check boxes to go through when you're picking your data loggers. So first things first, what kind of data can your logger log? Or in what range can it log, I guess. Most data loggers are made to be able to handle and record data that's quote unquote typical for museum environments. Again, I don't really think anything is truly typical, but it's that general type of kind of middle of the road to cool range. If your building or space does have more extreme temperatures, and by extreme I mean like outside of this general bond, not like 100 degrees usually, but that's just something to consider. And most of these things that I'm talking about here will be listed somewhere with the data logger when you go to buy it, or it should be. If you can't find that information, you can often contact the manufacturer, but they're usually fairly good about just saying saying what all of this stuff is. So next up is accuracy. And again, this is something that really needs to be supplied by the manufacturer, because it's difficult to know, oh, is this thing that's telling me the temperature telling me the right temperature? I'm going to get a second thing to tell me the temperature. And then it's kind of a rabbit hole down from there. They'll usually say, accurate to within plus or minus however many tenths of a degree. The degree of accuracy is also, unfortunately, usually related to the price and is based on the quality and type of sensor. So if you need some very specific, very accurate readings for whatever reason, that will almost always result in a more expensive data logger. But that's not to say that less expensive data loggers are bad. And these are, pretty small degrees. Most data loggers are going to get you a level of accuracy that is absolutely fine for most facilities and most environments. Again, unless you have something that needs to be at 62 degrees exactly or whatever, this will be fine for you. Something that I had to think about a lot when I was putting together this presentation, I was like, oh, I haven't done this in a while, is recalibration. Again, this will be listed, but it's making sure, and this is usually provided by the manufacturer as a service, making sure that the calibration of your data logger is still good. So basically you have to send it back. They will check and make sure it's still reading everything correctly to within, the correct level of accuracy that you should be getting. Timeframes for how often you should do this are different based on data loggers, and you can see in some of the charts that Leah will link later, but at least yearly is usually recommended. Again, recommended and what's practically realistic is not necessarily the same, but yeah, this is something to consider, because if you're not actually getting good data or accurate readings, then your program is not really helping you. All right, sorry, my slideshow decided to not go to the next slide for a second. Okay. Next up is power source and battery life. So this is to consider, does my data logger have to be plugged into something? Does it use batteries? Is it rechargeable, or do I have to, keep some AA's on hand? Generally, the more readings your logger is taking, the shorter the battery lifespan. So if something is taking readings every minute, it's going to have a much shorter lifespan than something that's taking readings every hour to every day. The loggers I have in our lab take readings every hour, but they do have a real-time display, so you can see specifically at one time, oh, this is what the temperature and RH are right at the second. It's also important to look for something called non-volatile memory, and what that means is that memory that keeps your data even if the device dies. So, if your environmental monitoring person is on vacation and something, malfunctions, or it was low on battery and they didn't realize and it dies, so that you don't just lose all of the data that it collected between the last time you exported that data and now. Related to that is the memory capacity and runtime. So how long can your data logger run, not just based on battery, but until it's full of data and cannot collect anything else? If your data logger does store data internally, there are some, and the type that we have at CCAHA automatically export data to the cloud, and in our case, to a website that accumulates and aggregates all of that data. But if your data logger doesn't do that and just keeps the data native until you remove it, how long can it do that? Because it may be less than when the battery runs out, and it's important to realize, oh, I have to collect my data, once a month or what have you, to make sure you're still getting new data. What kind of alarms or alerts does it have? Many data loggers will have an option to set alarms, so the system will notify you when it's out of a preset range that you've ascribed. Also figuring out who is informed and how. So for instance, the data loggers that we have are set to email myself, our facilities manager, and our head of conservation if it goes above a certain temperature threshold, so we can figure out what's happening and why. Not all data loggers will have the ability to connect to the internet or will have Bluetooth, although more and more do, and I would recommend it if it's possible for you. But yeah, how are they alerting you? How are you being alerted to something being out of set range? Next up, the display. Most data loggers will at least have a basic display with a battery readout or the real-time temperature and relative humidity. Some will also include oh, is it connected to Wi-Fi? Is the Bluetooth connected, etc. And some are full LCD screens even. There's a sliding scale of fanciness essentially that you can have. And this is I think more helpful if there isn't an easy portal for you to just view the data and you need to be looking at something on the logger itself. So generally, I think a super sophisticated screen isn't particularly important, but if it's important to you, then they are out there. Oh, come on, slideshow. There we go. All right, more features and considerations. There's a lot of them, and we're almost done, I promise. Now, most data loggers will naturally just do temperature and relative humidity. Some of them will have additional probes that you can buy and connect for things like measuring light and other relevant metrics. Some data loggers can also do light without an external probe, but will likely be much more expensive. One of the most important, I think, is service and technical support. So see what's included with your purchase, or if there's an additional costs for an ongoing support team. But if your data logger is difficult to troubleshoot, or if that's not your area of expertise, or if you're not comfortable doing that, making sure you have good support from the manufacturer is really important. Because if your data loggers aren't working, you're not getting data again. So making sure that you have a way to reliably get help if you need it is really important. And I think something that's going to be really important for most everyone is cost. We always have to talk about costs with almost everything in this world, unfortunately. As I mentioned before, pricier data loggers are likely going to be a little bit more accurate. But even if you can get any data logger, like I said, anything is better than nothing. Even if it's not perfectly accurate data, it's data. It'll give you an idea. So don't get it in your head like, oh, I have to get the super fancy, super cool, beautiful data logger. No, you don't. You can get a basic data logger that does the job, and that will be wonderful. And you can always also upgrade later if you start your environmental monitoring program and it's really recognized, and your institution or wherever you work says, wow, this is really valuable, we would like to invest in this. And you can say, okay, great, buy me these $500 data loggers. That's the dream. And finally, data loggers collect the data. They don't really interpret them. So depending on the logger and the system or software that it comes with or is available to you through the company, there are different levels of interpretation that it can kind of be doing, or not less interpretation, but more like data visualization, I guess I should say. So some will just give you basically lists of pure data, pure numbers. I would recommend trying to get one that also does graphs, because that's a lot more easily digestible on a day-to-day basis, and also is much easier to see, oh, we had a spike last night at midnight, what's up with that? Versus, oh, like reading, 20 lines of numbers and going, oh yeah, it did go up. So outside of preset alarms, you're really relying on the people who are in charge of your environmental monitoring program, and somewhat, to a certain extent, different software and interpreting programs to figure out what a good environment is. So all of the data collection in the world, all of the graphs in the world are worth nothing if there isn't somebody looking at them and saying, this is acceptable for X reasons, or no, we can't do this, we have to change something. You can't just have the data, although that is an important first step. You also have to look at the data and be able to say, here's what this is telling me, here's what I've learned, here's what we can change or improve. All right, we're done with data loggers. We did it. We talked about all of the data logger stuff, finally. But as I mentioned, if you don't have a data logger, it's not a problem. You'll be fine. You can still have a perfectly good environmental monitoring program. You don't need a data logger. These puppies believe in you, and you can do it. Like I said, they aren't always accessible for whatever reason, but alternatives exist. I chatted with you a little bit earlier about taking manual readings. And I did say that they are generally more time and work intensive, just because like a data logger can be taking a reading every hour, and that's no problem. It's sitting there, that's its job, that's what it's made to do. Having a person go around and take readings in like 4 or 5 different spots every hour it's untenable, it's unthinkable, that's not going to happen. But like I said, getting any amount of readings for any amount of data, at least to start, is better than nothing, and also is really going to help you figure out, okay, I have a general idea. I know generally what to expect from this space. And yeah, really don't be discouraged if you can only take intermittent readings, or readings, not as frequently as you should. Don't let that mindset keep you down. If you can take readings once a week, that's great. If you could do it more than that, even better. But just keep in mind, the more frequently you are taking readings, the better picture you will have. And I would also say to prioritize readings and data collection in collection, storage, and exhibit spaces first, and then expand to other areas like offices and adjacent zones as is feasible for you. Now, this is a system where it might be helpful to involve more people. So for instance, with the data loggers, it's, I think, simpler to have kind of one person who's in charge of monitoring those, because it's not particularly time intensive. But if you have to be taking readings all around this building, it's going to take a lot of time for one person to do. So if you can split up that work and split up that the data gathering, that can really make it less of a big onerous task for one person. If 3 or 4 people are like, oh, I'll do one space, you do one space, okay, it's 5 minutes of my day, that's doable. So as far as alternative data gathering goes, what do you use to get this data? For temperature, like I mentioned before, just look at the display on your thermostat. It'll give you a pretty good idea. It won't be 100%, but it will be within several degrees, so you can at least know, oh, this space is 70 degrees versus it's 50 degrees. And that is something that's important and helpful to have at the get-go. You can also just get a standard wall thermometer. You can get a digital one even fairly inexpensively that'll get you a slightly more accurate reading, just like at a CVS or something, or from Amazon. You can usually get like a multi-pack. And again, just like in addition to your thermostat, and as well as to just expand to other areas of your building to put them around, just again to have an idea, because you're not going to have a thermostat in every room, most likely. For relative humidity, in researching for this presentation, I found, and this is something I didn't know, so I learned something fun. A lot of modern digital thermometers will also include RH readings. Again, these are these are probably not going to be very accurate. And these, again, disclaimer, like these thermometers are not data loggers. They do not keep the data. You have to physically go there and look at them to know what the temperature and RH are at any given time. But it's, I think, way simpler than having to carry something around. You can just look at it on the wall and go, okay, it's 70 degrees in here, 45% humidity. Great, done. There are also relative humidity strips available, and that's the picture I have here at the bottom right of kind of the pink to blue scale. And these are available through a lot of different conservation and preservation suppliers. But these are reversible, so they change color based on what the relative humidity in the area is, but they're only by 10%. So, you can know generally it's around 40% or it's around 60%, but it's not going to give you anything specific. And also they do get kind of worn out after a while. So they're more effective when they're new. But again, this is great, especially for really small spaces like exhibit cases, things like that, where it's not as easy to necessarily get in and out frequently with a data logger. Not a data logger. We're done with data loggers. With any other kind of measuring equipment. And last, is light, which we haven't talked about so much in this presentation, just because temperature and RH, relative humidity, are really the two main pillars of environmental monitoring, but light is also very important. There are smartphone apps that exist that measure light. Really, they say they do, and I've downloaded a couple and tested them out, and they're definitely not 100% accurate, but again, they will give you a general sense of, is it 50 lux in here? Is it 200 lux in here? I don't know. So you can, again, a lot of this is to at least get you a general idea as a place to start from, so you can figure out, what your environment is like. You can also get an LSEC, which I have a photo of at the top right here, which measures temperature, relative humidity, and as well as visible and ultraviolet light. They are fairly expensive though, but this is a piece of equipment that I think you may already have. And if you don't, then you can't justify the expense for data loggers. LSEC is not going to be it, but if you already have an LSEC on hand and can't get data loggers, that's a great way to gather data. All right. So my final thoughts for you are developing an environmental monitoring program. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of time. You can't expect to have a perfect, complete program right away, and you shouldn't. It like anything, you're going to start somewhere and be, this is the best I can do right now. And as you learn more and get more information, you're going to say, okay, I can do this now. I can do something a little bit more, a little bit better. So yeah, your program is going to evolve and change as you learn more and get more resources and maybe get more monetary support, or are able to fundraise to get more and better equipment. But at any point in this process, you should really just try to do what you can with the knowledge and resources you have at the time. And also don't be afraid to ask for help. Personally, I've had great experience with my colleagues in the cultural heritage sector. I was not always the environmental monitoring guru presented to you here today, but folks are generally really willing to share their own findings, tips, answer questions. So if you know someone who works at another nearby facility, or you have a friend who runs their environmental monitoring program, you can just sit down, have a virtual meeting or go get a coffee and say, all right, what are you doing? How do you do this? Do you have any tips for me? And most folks, like I said, are super willing and able to help and provide that information. It's also important to just continually seek out additional training or workshops, or keep up to date on new publications about environmental monitoring and what the hottest, newest recommendations are. There's always more to learn. There's always something else to know. There's a lot out there already. So if this presentation is your first sort of foray into environmental monitoring, there's so much more that you can learn already. But I think most important of all is to just remember that perfect is the enemy of good. If you're trying to do everything perfect right away, it probably won't be, and that's all right. If something is good enough, then it's good. And as I have sort of said many times throughout this presentation, any data is better than no data. And just doing what you can with the resources that you have is the most that can be expected, and is wonderful. And you shouldn't feel bad or discouraged if whatever you have access to isn't perfect or isn't what you quote unquote should be doing. Because like I said, it's a process. There's always going to be growth and change. So don't be discouraged if it's not perfect at the start. This is my reference to slide. There's a lot of great information here. Leo will be sending this out for you all to be able to click links and go to these places for some further reading. But this is just a very, like I mentioned, there's so much out there. These are only the first few things. You're gonna fall down a rabbit hole if you really start looking into this stuff. But that is it for me. Thank you all so much for joining me this afternoon. If you have any questions, now is the time. And this is one of my coworkers' pet's popcorn with an LSEC, which was a picture that was too good to not use.
So we're just going to give everyone like a minute or so to pop your questions into the chat box. If you're having trouble locating the chat box, it should be on either the bottom bar of your screen, or if you're in full screen mode, you can go up to the top and there should be an option in there. So we have a question. Did you mention the building envelope? You don't want to be pumping humidity into a building with no vapor barrier.
Yes, I did briefly talk about building envelope in one of my first slides. And that's good to think about. If the building isn't going to hold in humidity, it's probably not very efficient to be doing that. It might help somewhat, and also if you can have individual humidity controls, for instance, in display cases or things like that, or if there's a vapor barrier around your collections area, like storage space specifically, then that's fine. But if there's no way to hold that humidity in, then it's not going to be particularly helpful.
Okay, and the next question is, what are the recommended intervals for monitoring? Every hour, 2 hours, every 4 hours, etc.?
Sure. At CCAHA for our program, our loggers are set for every hour. You can absolutely do more frequently. I know that there are other programs, other places that do, every half hour, stuff like that. I think every hour is what I would really recommend. With a data logger, like I mentioned in my presentation, not feasible if you are doing manual data collection. But every hour really gives you a good picture of what's happening throughout the day, because a lot can really change in an hour, especially if your building has a lot of windows, for instance, and the position of the sun makes a huge difference in the temperature. So for instance, if you were only doing every 4 hours and it was like, first thing in the morning, and then 4 hours later, the sun may have moved on and you might not be getting that data in between. But again, like I've said throughout, whatever you can do is great. So don't be held back by it if you're like, oh, I can't do every hour for whatever reason.
The next question here is a two-parter. So how often would you recommend that environmental data is interpreted, and who in your institution should be the target audience for presenting this interpreted data?
Sure. There are, again, depending on how much time you have available to interpret data, I would recommend at least quarterly, so you get a sort of seasonal sense of what's happening. Someone should be checking the data more frequently than that and like looking at graphs and looking for anomalies, but putting together a report or a presentation or something like that, at least quarterly. If you can at least be doing some sort of data interpretation monthly or even weekly, if that's doable for you, that's even better. Even if that's just like exporting the data, into graphs, labeling the graphs, making sure those are saved, and having the data accessible. That's important. But yeah, for like a full on like report of like, this is what the environment has been at our institution, I think quarterly is good. And the second part, oh yeah, who should be the target audience? I think there are a couple different people who will be interested and maybe swayed by environmental data. First of all, if you're an institution that works with, conservators or curators, people working directly with the objects who want to make sure that their objects, or not their objects, but the objects at your institution are in a good environment for them. I think it's very interesting and relevant to those people. It's also very interesting and relevant to if you have like a separate building management team, for them to know like, oh, this is, and also working with them generally. Because if you're trying to make it be one temperature and they don't know that, it's easy for miscommunications to cause issues. But also, I think it's important for management to be able to, if not like look at this data directly, have someone tell them this is what we're dealing with right now, because that's a great way for you to hopefully get additional support for your environmental monitoring program by showing them this is something really worthwhile and important. That's been helping us out a lot. So I think I personally will send out my quarterly reports to everyone at CCAHA, or at least let them know when they're available usually, so folks can look at them if they want and if they're interested. But also I'm not trying to like fundraise for data loggers or anything like that. So I think it really depends on what your goals are, I suppose.
And we have one more question in the chat for now, and that is, are mouse traps your go-to for rodent control? I do have trouble with mice.
Oh gosh, I'll be frank, I have not dealt with mice personally, so this is a little bit outside of my experience, and I don't really have a recommendation. I would assume mouse traps are fine, but that's not based on any particular experience. My apologies.
Okay, and let's just give it one more minute in case folks are typing any last questions.
Mm-hmm.
But that is looking like that is it for now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, everyone. Also, I should mention that I can be contacted at my CCAHA email address, which I did not think to include here, so apologies. Oh, I can also put you on this slide. So you can also contact DHPSNY with any questions.
Yeah, and Chloe's email will be included in that post-program email where you all will be getting all of those super useful links, as well as a PDF of the slides and a link to the recording of this presentation.
Yes, so if a burning question occurs to you after this presentation, please feel free to email me.
Okay, so I am not seeing any more questions in the chat. So I am going to close us out with that. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you, Chloe, for such a wonderful presentation. If you enjoyed today's webinar and would like to learn more about our upcoming educational programs, please check out dhpsny.org/education. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.